Hello and welcome to McKinsey Live. I'm Lucia Rahilly, McKinsey's editorial director and your host for today's event, an inside look at last week's meeting of the World Economic Forum, which wrapped up Friday in Davos, Switzerland. Today's event will be an all Q&A format, which is unusual for us. So if you're in our registered audience, this is your chance to ask what really happened at the meeting on the mountaintop. We've got a packed house, virtually speaking, today, but we'll do our best to monitor the Q&A and cover at least a selection of your questions throughout this half hour that we have together. Joining us today are three key members of McKinsey's Davos delegation: Tracy Francis, Daniel Pacthod, and Rodney Zemmel. Tracy is managing partner of our Latin American offices, where she focuses on enhancing Latin America's global profile and accelerating sustainable and inclusive growth. You will hear her charming Australian accent, but don't let that fool you. Tracy has for some time been based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Daniel, in fact, leads McKinsey's collaboration with the World Economic Forum. And in addition to serving a broad range of clients, for the last 15 years, he has built and scaled our firm capabilities. As we speak, he is heading up what we call our Leadership Factory, which is a global initiative to develop leaders both at clients and internally. He also co-founded our sustainability practice, the On and On. Daniel is based in New York. And Rodney is
also... He also has a charming accent, I think.
He does have a charming accent. All three of you, actually. I'm looking poorly on this.
You'll have to guess.
Yeah. Rodney, you're also here in New York. Rodney is the global leader of McKinsey Digital, where he helps clients harness the power of AI, modernize their core tech, and build new digital businesses. Rodney is also the co-author of the best-selling book Rewired, where he translates some of these hard-won lessons for the rest of us. And he also leads our own AI transformation within McKinsey, which is rewiring the way that we operate as a firm. Tracy, Daniel, and Rodney, welcome back to McKinsey Live.
Thanks, Lucia.
Great being with you, Lucia, and Tracy and Rodney.
Happy to be here.
Great to have you today. Thanks for making the time for us in this, post-WEF maelstrom. Last week's gathering was reported to be the largest in the forum's more than 54-year history. Something like 3,000 leaders assembled, representing 130 countries and the gamut of sectors under the umbrella theme Collaboration for the Intelligent Age. And this Davos obviously hit at a complex moment as leaders confront what appear to be big changes in geopolitical dynamics with potential trade and macroeconomic ramifications. Tracy, you are a Davos veteran at this point. How would you characterize the mood on the mountaintop last week, and anything to infer on what that might say about how leaders are feeling going into 2025?
Sure, and thanks for the question, Lucia. It was interesting. I think everyone got on the plane headed towards Davos expecting that topics such as the macroeconomy, geopolitics, sustainability, AI would be on the agenda. But there was, as you can imagine, a certain arc to the emotions of the week, right? Starting with the inauguration on Monday. And I think as we got towards the back end of the week, we saw quite a segmented Davos, right? We saw American business leaders really feeling quite energized, I think, and optimistic, regardless of political leaning, principally because of the excitement around, potentially deregulation. I think we saw a much more muted sense from European leaders, ranging from concern for what does this mean, passion for the importance of some of the regulation that exists in Europe. And perhaps the most optimistic sense there was a desire to band together to provide the counterweight that Europe can provide. And then the other geographies were, in my view, more muted than usual, in part just because there was so much going on around the discussion of tariffs and that type of thing, but more muted than usual and needing to sort of find space to talk about themselves, which certainly happened in many different areas. But I think we saw a much more sort of, American European sentiment than in past years.
So thanks for that. We did speak on McKinsey Live just prior to Davos about what we as a firm expected to drive the agenda at this year's meeting. Daniel, why don't you recap for us, if you would, what actually materialized? So at a high level, what are some of the overarching themes that, in your view, dominated conversations?
Well, thanks, Lucia, and we have a long-standing partnership with the World Economic Forum. I think we hosted. We might look a bit tired, although it's a few days ago, but we hosted something like 27 events with 1,800 clients. And the first thing that was on everybody's mind, or in every other sentence, was really AI and Gen AI. We hosted a super interesting CEO convening early in the week on how do we actually make sure Gen AI shows up in the P&L. And I think there was just a lot of excitement. I know Rodney is going to talk a lot more about this, but this was really in all the conversations. The second thing was really geopolitics. We released our second collaboration with the World Economic Forum, where we published kind of a collaboration barometer. And just to take a bit of a pulse on where are we on geopolitics. And I think all the conversations were around how do we turn geopolitics into a muscle for companies, into a muscle for countries. And I think, as Tracy said, I think with the new administration, the inauguration, I think a lot of the strategies and the plans from the US were front and center. But it really, everybody on the mountain really talked a lot about this, and we're not going back to the old world. We also talked quite a bit about resilience. We published our third report with the World Economic Forum on resilience, and to some extent, resilient countries, resilient firms, and then resilient leaders. And basically, this was also all around comparing notes on, how should leaders be on the front foot? We're not going back to the world we were in before. I think there was more headwinds. And I think there was a bit of a sense that, best defense is perhaps to play offense in this world, and what kind of actions should leaders take? We also talked, Tracy talked about the US. We also published a report, and we worked with the World Economic Forum on European competitiveness in the intelligent age. And Rodney was making fun of my accent. And yes, I grew up in Europe. And if I have to say one thing, which is now is the time for Europe to take bold actions. I think I've never seen a sense of urgency as what was happening last week, and to some extent also based on some of the moves, I think, and the announcements from the US. On the energy transition, I think we're perhaps realizing more than ever before that we have to run two energy systems in parallel, right? The current fossil fuel system and then the new clean energy system. And it's going to take time. And I think it's going to be about affordability, about energy security. We had some super interesting discussions around nature and nature capital. And frankly, there was also realization with the tragedy with the Los Angeles fires that we have to spend more time on adaptation. And then, perhaps two more topics, one around women's health, which is a topic that I think we were very passionate about as a firm. We've collaborated with the World Economic Forum. Roughly, 25% of a woman lives in worse health situation for 25% of their lives than men, and it's roughly $1 trillion gap. It's actions we can take immediately, and so there's a real call for action on this. Similar collaboration about the brain health and brain economy. I think something that we're just starting, where we think there's a ton of opportunity. And then finally, on Wednesday, we had a phenomenal breakfast with Andy Jassy, with Jane Fraser, and Robert Ugla, where we talked about leadership and leadership in the 21st century, and what does it take? What are the leadership traits to be able to lead in the 21st century, and how do we build leaders for tomorrow? Let me just pause there, but a quick rundown on some of the topics we talked about over the week.
And thank you, Daniel. Folks in the audience can see we've got a rich repository of content on all of these themes, quite frankly, but there are some new pieces of research that we've published to coincide with Davos, and you can access those via the QR codes that are currently on screen. Okay, so we are being inundated with questions on the topic of AI and Gen AI. This is no surprise, but perhaps, particularly not a surprise given the DeepSeek headlines. at last year's Davos, Rodney, Gen AI felt pretty new, right? It felt like folks were still marveling at it, looking at it with wild surmise, as Keats would say, whereas now talk seems to anchor a little more pragmatically on P&L impact and whether leaders are actually realizing benefits to their bottom line. Before we talk a little bit about DeepSeek, if you would, what's your take here based on your discussions of Gen AI at Davos?
Yeah, sure. And look, I wasn't there last year, so I can't compare. But, as I was setting up for this meeting this morning, I actually found I was there in 2000 and I actually found the attendance book from 2000. That's literally a book. And I found in it, actually, here it had everybody's name. Here's Bill Gates, a very young looking Bill Gates, back when Microsoft revenue was 20 billion. They've grown like more than 20-fold since then. And, what do I share that? I think to make the point that Davos has long been a tech meeting or a tech heavy meeting. And I remember in 2000 when I was there as a junior helper outer, Bill Gates was demonstrating to a room of life science CEOs a new laptop where you could like turn the screen around. And that was like the wow moment that people were talking about. So I think there's always been sort of like, tech wows. But this time, it is very clear that it was, as Tracy and Daniel both said, an AI conference, right? And as you walked along the promenade, it was AI, AI, AI. What's interesting is everybody sort of had the same diagnostic. They were saying, look, AI 2025 is the year we need to really turn it into business impact, right? To go from pilots to business impact. But what was interesting from the different players that were there was actually some quite different prescriptions for how to get to business impact, right? Some were saying, it's we can, you focus on your business. We can be an outsourced provider to bring you business impact. Others were saying it's about, new technology, agents are going to be the big unlock to get business impact. So same diagnostic, but some quite different prescriptions for how to get there. And we, of course, talked a lot about our view, which is that, look, 2024 was the year the technology delivered, right? But the humans really didn't, right? And the opportunity now is to take a more business-led approach and really to take a more, frankly, top-down approach to rewiring parts of your business to deliver AI impact rather than just treating it as a broad range of technology pilots.
Interesting. This DeepSeek news happened after Davos ended, or it hit the headlines after Davos ended. Any preliminary comments on what to make of this situation?
Yeah, so look, the cognoscenti would say it happened before Davos, right? Because there was a DeepSeek model V3, right, that people were talking about and the paper was out. But I think what you're referring to is this R1 model that came out and like rocked the stock market yesterday. Look, it's too early to really understand like what's going on. But the range of reactions is interesting, right? Some external commentators have said, look, this is a Sputnik moment for the US and sort of tried to make it a geopolitics story. Other people are saying, look, my colleague Alex Sukarevsky had a great quote saying, look, this is one of 5 amazing things that are going to happen in AI this year, right? We just need to be ready for them. I personally feel this says as much or more about open source as it does about geopolitics. I mean, yes, the model came from China, but it was based on open source work that's been done in the US and elsewhere. I think this shows how much power there's going to be in many different models, right? We already think there's 6 or more models that are somewhat equivalent. That number's probably going to go up. So there's going to be broad access to incredibly powerful models and reasoning models. It shows that the big leap forwards are going to come from clever engineering and model architecture, right? This is an improvement in model architecture and combining generative AI with reinforcement learning rather than just from chip design. So it's quite a complicated game board, right? Now, if you look at the stock market, right, $1 trillion lost, that's not a good day for the tech industry. But I think you can make the argument that in the long run or even the medium run, it's actually a very good thing because this is going to massively lower the cost if it plays out, right? We don't know, right? But this could massively lower the cost of inference, right? Not just training. Training helps big tech companies. Inference will help ordinary companies apply AI. So as costs of applying AI continue to come down, this is going to continue to democratize the technology, right? And there's so much pent up demand, right? And even as people talk about what does this mean for the huge boom in data centers, right? There are such constraints right now. Anything that actually helps unlock those constraints a little bit. It's probably good for corporate AI adopters, and in the long run is good for the tech industry in terms of growing the market opportunity.
Super interesting. It's such an interesting time. Okay, watch this space. This is perhaps a good segue to another topic that's at the forefront of our audience's mind. We've had a ton of questions here on geopolitics, obviously, and global cooperation. Tariffs and the dynamics of geostrategic competition have, again, been all over the headlines, as all of you have mentioned. Daniel, what were your conversations like at Davos about challenges and opportunities related to these geopolitical shifts, and what would you highlight for us of importance here?
So, Lucia, on geopolitics, I think the core of the discussion really, I think, centered on, competitiveness of nations and the importance of, the industrial base, the importance of, perhaps 4 or 5 big technologies. And, Rodney talked about Gen AI and AI, chipsets, defense and the defense ecosystem, and then, frankly, the whole climate tech set of capabilities with, we relaunched our nuclear practice 2 years ago. I think there was a lot of talk about fusion and nuclear as well. And I think what you realize is, with all the announcements and everybody trying to decipher what's really going to happen with tariffs and in the US, ultimately this boils down to that, which is the competitiveness of nations. And I think, there was a lot of, excitement and I would say optimism from a lot of US executives. I think it was also remarkable to see this was a really global Davos. I think very strong contingents from Japan, with I think also a almost Japan back at the table with leading also on some of these key technologies. Large India contingent, and frankly, our team has been working also on this is India's century, and I think the acceleration of the transformation of India, and I think that was very clear. I'd say countries like Indonesia also really at the table. So, back to the point we made earlier, geopolitical as a muscle. Rodney, Tracy, and I were comparing notes. We're not going back to the simple world from 20 years ago, and so you really have to have the pulse on all these different centers of the world, and then also go back to, at the end of the day, what is playing out here is the competitiveness of nations. And this is also why I think there was a sense from a lot of European CEOs that it's pretty clear where the puck is going in the US. And by the way, a lot of European companies are interested in moving actually and being more present in the US. But there was the realization that it is really critical for Europe to really now have a bit of a wake-up call and frankly take actions against what's pointed out in the Draghi report, and also the report that we published with together with the WEF.
Yeah, and Daniel, when you're saying competitiveness of nations, right? You're not implying zero sum, right?
No. Yeah. That's right.
I do think, just to that point, sorry, Lucia, now we've gone completely, beyond the planning. But as you said, I look after our Latin America region, and some of our countries are in the spotlight right now, as our audience will be aware. One of the things that of course, business leaders are, working on being prepared, and what do different tariff scenarios look like, and how quickly can they move their businesses around. That's I think relatively obvious. But one of the things that did give me a sense of optimism was discussion of new trade corridors, and you actually physically see these new trade corridors emerging as, a different set of folks turn up to the Latin American meetings than used to, a different set of folks turn up to the Africa meetings than you're used to, and I think we're going to see some movement around that.
It's super interesting. So all the dynamics that we're describing point to rising complexity in the operating environment for leaders, right? So that might make a nice segue to, there are many questions here about what this means for leaders. Daniel, maybe this one would be good for you, given your focus on developing the next generation of leaders. How do you think about equipping executives to navigate this current, uncertainty?
I mean, there was a bit of a sense, you can always be a bit nostalgic, but there was a bit of a sense from CEOs that it's actually more difficult to be a CEO and a leader today than ever before. Mm-hmm. And, one CEO pointed out, 10 years ago, I had 5% of my calendar ready for, surprises, challenges, things that were not planned. That number is more 20 or 30% today. And I think the amount of headwinds and complexities are just rising and are compounding. I think there was very energizing discussion on, what are these future leadership traits? And I think it's all about, energy. It's about, frankly, the ability, grit and resilience. It's about the ability to work in team. I think it's the ability to constantly learn. And also, frankly, to have people basically be put in roles, almost like high potential, be put in roles and then learn on the job. And then creating a bit of a mechanism that, frankly, cannot be outsourced by the leadership team, is owned by the CEO to build tomorrow's leaders. And I think when we had our breakfast on Wednesday morning, I think that came across very clearly. And I think there was also, we wanted to talk about Gen AI, but I think there was a sense that, we got to really invest in leadership now. And this is perhaps one of the most important things that CEOs and leaders got to do. And these leaders have to be able to operate in this new global environment.
Makes sense. And related, Tracy, there are a number of questions here on the workforce generally, whether that's, skilling for AI adoption or rethinking the global talent footprint, or just the challenge of talent supply and demand. Investing in people was one of the core themes at Davos this year, not just leaders, but people within the workforce generally. Any key takeaways to share on talent in particular?
Yeah, I'm going to actually talk about something that, is perhaps a little less expected, and Rodney should address, talent shortages for AI. But one of the topics that was really on the agenda was health, including health of the workforce. And so we actually had two separate collaborations with the WEF, both of which I think were really interesting to this point. One of which is on brain health, which, as you can imagine, sort of spans from, early childhood. Actually, it spans from, the child in utero all the way through to the elderly, but includes a large chunk of, the working population. And we launched a collaboration there that had, executives from food industry, med tech, pharma, as well as government agencies, as well as philanthropists, to really start trying to work on kind of cross-functional and cross-discipline approaches to how do we increase resilience and health and satisfaction of all people, including the workforce. So that was one. And then the second one was this area of women's health, where we started that last year, but it really consolidated this year. And what was one of the factoids is that women spend 25% of their life in worse health, in poor health, 25% more than men, and half of that is during the working years, right? So that results in enormous amounts of absenteeism, also, less productivity and that type of thing. And when you do all the computations on that number, the opportunity is astronomical. It's sort of in the realm of $1 trillion. And so we were really starting this year to move to action as to what can companies and governments do in order to drive that productivity for women's health.
Super interesting. Rodney, do you want to add anything on talent there, or?
Yeah, I guess Tracy leaves me to talk about the talent one then, which is good because talent, I think, has become a tech topic, right? Because the big question, of course, is what does AI, and maybe even more specifically agentic AI agents, mean for talent in the workforce? And what's interesting is, look, I think there was lots of theoretical discussion around, okay, now AI comes for the knowledge worker, right? Are we going to have mass sort of white collar layoffs and so on? And while that was sort of some of the academic discussion in the panels and so on, you look at the reality, and the new McKinsey demographic report that we released just before Davos, 2/3 of the world now lives in countries where the population is growing at below the replacement rate, right? So massive labor shortages, right? And when we looked at and heard from some of the companies in Davos who've been early successful adopters of AI and generative AI, they're actually using it to grow in areas where there are labor shortages, right? Companies and governments, by the way, right? Areas where there are really acute labor shortages, right? So using this actually to grow in places where you're labor constrained, right, is going to be an early sort of success example. And then, when I look at the example, and again, this was talked about by some of the players there, in US retail, Who would have guessed that there are more people who work in US retail today than a decade ago, right? With everything that has happened with e-commerce and so on. Boys, more people today than a decade ago. The jobs have changed, of course, but net more people. So will technology continue to do that, right? Will AI create more jobs, or will there be a net reduction in jobs after a displacement effect? Nobody really knows, and I'm sure there'll be academics on the panels in Davos debating that next year as well. But I think the early returns of how it's actually being used are pointing more to job creation than job destruction.
Interesting. Okay, I'm mindful of time. I'm going to ask one more question that seems like a fitting way to close our conversation today. Coming out of the week, we've gotten a lot of questions on what very practically business leaders should focus on amid this kind of welter of uncertainties. What is one tactical piece of advice that you'll be sharing with your clients for 2025? And Rodney, why don't we start with you?
I'm glad that's your question. I thought you were going to ask how was the skiing, and sadly, no one skis there. Even though it was like a perfect snow week, it was sad to look at the slopes. One practical piece of advice: pick one area of your business that can really be reimagined with technology. Set a real financial goal for it and lean into that. Right? Stop sprinkling AI and generative AI and agents and pilots everywhere, but approach it as a business problem and approach it in a focused way.
Excellent. Daniel, let's hear it.
I would one thing I take away is I would raise the bar as a leader, as a CEO for your leadership team on the learning and the leadership development that you have to basically invest in this new world, right? And I know Rodney showed his book, and I think Tracy and I spent a lot of time with Rodney, and we are getting upskilled on technology and Gen AI and AI. But I come back from this week and I say, listen, the leadership teams that are going to win in this environment are the ones that will be really tech savvy, are the ones that will build real resilience, that will create learning culture, but frankly will create a factory that builds leaders at scale. And because that is the limiting factor of any frankly organization to thrive in this environment. So it's almost like that learning bar and leadership development bar as just keeps going up, and I think it needs to be owned by the CEO, by the leadership team.
Interesting. Tracy, anything quickly?
Yeah, I love this because you add each of the three together, right? For me, what really struck me was I had the opportunity to meet with three different geopoliticians, if that's a word, and the scenarios that they painted were wildly different, right? Three people, three wildly different scenarios. And so for me, the takeaway for the business leaders who I interact with beyond what Daniel and Rodney said is be prepared for there being no clarity for a period of time. Work out there for what the scenarios for existing business are and invest in developing new trade corridors.
Fantastic. Okay, that brings us to time. This has been a great discussion. Thank you again for joining us today, Tracy, Daniel, and Rodney.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Lucia.
And as always, many thanks to all of you in our McKinsey Live audience for being together with us today, especially to those of you who sent in such thoughtful questions. We got many of them. You will be able to find a replay of this in our previous McKinsey Live sessions at mckinsey.com/live. And be sure to join us again in February when we'll talk about our latest research on the state of fashion. That's Tuesday, February 18th, just following New York Fashion Week. Should be a lot of fun. See you there. Have a great day or evening and be well.